We're now going to move on to look at Act 2. Now, there's lots of key quotations to remember from Act 1, Scene 3. So, first of all, we looked at Faustus's incantation of Mephistopheles. Note he says, "And try if devils will obey thy hest rather than just spirits." And in the question and answer session between Faustus and Mephistopheles, there is a lot of really interesting stuff here. So when we hear one rack the name of God, we fly in hope to get his glorious soul, says Mephistopheles. Faustus, questioning Mephistopheles, learns that they got there by aspiring pride and insolence. He says, "Why, this is hell, nor am I out of it," and so on. All of this is really important to remember. Faustus, of course, is unconvinced, and refers to them as vain trifles of men's souls, and says, "Learn thou of Faustus manly fortitude." Do try to remember as many of these as you can. On to Act 2 then. Now, there is some uncertainty about the first 3 lines. Here at the top is the A text, then the version you have in your editions, and finally the B text. As you can see, in the B text, each of the first 3 lines ends with a question mark. "Now, Faustus, must thou needs be damned, and canst thou not be saved? What boots it then to think on God or heaven?" Now, obviously, if the first 2 lines are questions rather than statements, then that changes the implications quite considerably. Faustus, in his mind, implicitly leaves open the possibility that the answer is, no, you're not damned. Yes, you can be saved. Simkin, cited in your edition, page 32, notes that the B text offers a ray of hope that the A text shuts out, he says. Now that's going too far, I think, a little. Your edition says at the top of the page, "Faustus wavers irresolutely between God and Lucifer." The trouble with this is that there isn't really much wavering. Here's the whole thing. We're talking about 10 lines. Faustus resolves himself much too quickly, I think, for us really to call it wavering. On the other hand, notice the final line of that soliloquy, "and offer lukewarm blood of newborn babes." Now, this is certainly rather macabre imagery, gothic, etc., and in one sense does give the sense that he has surrendered himself to evil and so on. But it's all rather crude. Marlowe is capable of much more than that. It may be, rather, that he's simply trying to convince himself, steeling himself by evoking the most horrific and anti-Christian imagery he can think of. Mephistopheles appears and Faustus signs the bargain. Now, last time perhaps I made too much of Mephistopheles being a proto-Miltonic Satan, someone with whom we can perhaps even sympathise, especially when seen with Faustus at his most infantile. Now, some things very briefly to counter that. Number 1, the devil can cite scripture for his purpose. Now, while this is a quote from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, not the Bible, it is based on the temptation of Christ, the Gospel for Ash Wednesday, which I suggest you read. It's up here now, Matthew chapter 4. Doesn't this scene prove this point? And number 2, by presenting himself in all these almost positive ways, noble, humble, moral, is this not itself a kind of manipulation? In Acts 2, Scene 1, we do see a much more manipulative side to Mephistopheles. He demonstrates this in a couple of ways. First of all, double meanings. His responses to Faustus are full of equivocation, and "give thee more than thou hast wit to ask." It's not hard to see the double meaning here. Secondly, line 52, "and then be thou as great as Lucifer." Out of context, what a promise! Faustus will be as great as Lucifer, Prince of Hell. But remember, Lucifer too is being tortured. Mephistopheles has just reminded us that their torments are as great as have the human souls of men. Why did it say humane here? What a typo, sorry about that. Notice in this excerpt, by the way, that it is Mephistopheles who is setting the agenda, driving on the action in this scene, in contrast structurally to Act 1, Scene 3. All of this direct address. 3 times he says, "But Faustus." We keep hearing "thou must" and various imperatives. The second thing is his use of the aside. In general, it's unclear whether asides are meant to be simply overheard by the audience, as if they were mini soliloquies, the character voicing his thoughts, or whether they are actually addressed to us. The latter seems to have been the case in medieval moralities. Oh, what will I not do to obtain his soul? I'll fetch him somewhat to delight his mind. If we are, in a sense, being included in his plans, is that making us morally complicit? Looking now at Faustus, some very dramatic moments here where he cuts his arm, signs the bond, his blood congeals and then reliquefies with the hot coals, and then he sees the words Homo fugae, flee, O thou man, on his arm. Perhaps it won't have as much impact when we see it in a few weeks in a modern 20th century theatre, but the stage business must have been impressive in the 16th century. Blood is highly symbolic, in the Gothic, in Christianity, and in the play. When we see the ending of the play, and that wonderful line, see, see Christ's blood streaming in the firmament, we will think back to this. As several have remarked, the play relies on a number of grotesque inversions of Christian truth. We've been talking about Faustus being a reverse morality, and we'll discuss how it's like an inverse saint's life. This moment is a terrible parody of the crucifixion. Faustus sheds his blood. His words to seal the deed are consummatum est, it is finished, Christ's last words on the cross. And so the parody is linguistic too. I won't spend too long at all on the end of this scene. We'll look at it in more detail when we revise the characterisation of Mephistopheles. Faustus questions him further about hell and damnation, and we return to something similar to Act 1, Scene 3. Note how similar Mephistopheles' response is to what he said earlier, this is hell, nor am I out of it. So here, hell hath no limits, nor is it circumscribed in one self-place. For where we are is hell, and where hell is, there must we ever be. Again, a similar response from Faustus. Come, I think hell's a fable. Mephistopheles does perhaps attempt to educate Faustus as to what he's got himself into, but Faustus, I am an instance to prove the contrary, for I am damned and am now in hell. But Faustus is not to be convinced. But notice how quickly he changes the subject. This is the same in the B text, which quite often tidied bits up, for want of a better expression, and regularised the text in blank verse. Faustus, after saying, how, now in hell? Nay, and this be hell, I'll willingly be damned here. What? Walking, disputing, etc. He goes straight on to, but leaving off this, let me have a wife. What is this? A further indictment of Faustus using the devil for the most base bodily pleasures? Or, rather, is he intentionally distracting himself? Just as at the start of the scene he concluded his moral debate very quickly indeed. Is he unwilling, or unable, to go further into questioning the grave moral implications of what he has done, and so he is looking for distraction as soon as he can?